So very happy to be here another year in Toronto to talk about the router this time. Very excited as well because it's a topic I've been digging for a few months and almost like a year already. And there is a lot to it. Fortunately, I'm not going to go into the very deep things of it because it gets quite messy and not interesting technical things. Specifications with regional algorithms that are not that interesting to read. So I'm mostly going to focus on the improvements that we have internally that we're going to bring more than the changements in the API, because as Evan said, we will have to think about it later in the future. Even though we have some ideas already, we are not implementing them or anything. But there is a rewrite going on. And I want to talk to you about the things I've discovered, things I've changed, and improvements that are already in the code by itself. So some of the things about myself that Phil didn't say, I also organized the meetup VueJS in Paris. So if you ever come by and you want to give a talk, just hit me up on Twitter or anywhere. You can find me with Pozva, and we can set up something. So I do maintain a lot of things related to Vue, and the one that takes the most of my time is the Vue router, at least lately. Even though I'm not the original author of the code, I think I've managed to get a good understanding of the code base itself after that much time, and it still strikes me how difficult sometimes it is to get your routing set up correctly. And this is no matter the application, no matter the framework you're using, the first time, the first week, the first few days, you use your application, that's easy. It's this cute little JavaScript or TypeScript file, or CoffeeScript if you're still there. But as the project grows, as the need changes, and you keep adding things, if you use features from the router, you realize you have this beast that is untamable. And this is, no matter the framework, you always have this. So this is for myself as well. And I'm realizing, I'm thinking, why do we have this? Can we really overcome this? Is this something inherent to how the router is supposed to work, the API surface that the router is covering? So I look at all the routers and say to myself, is this like everybody else? And when you look at any other router, you will find that there is this trade-off we have to take in mind is, do we want to bring as much flexibility to the user as we can at the cost of making the user write more code? Or do we want to be more opinionated and leave the user, make the code simpler basically, but also restricting some use cases that you may not be able to achieve? And the idea is, where do we place this trade-off? Do we place these more on the flexibility side? Do we place it right in the middle? Or do we place it in the opinionated? And more importantly, isn't there a way to have maybe multiple APIs that allows to have both of the best worlds? So if we look at three kind of routers, I think these are the most common ones. We have three different ones: imperatives, declarative, and configuration-based. It doesn't mean that you have to be exclusively one of them. You can have both at the same time and have partially things. An example of an imperative router is the page.js router. So this is very similar to express routing, if you have ever used that. Basically, you have one function, and you call that function for everything. So you call that function for adding routes, you call that function for navigating, and you also make that function receive all the functions to create what we call navigation guides, and they call that middlewares. So it's also something they call a middleware-based architecture. So if you take a list of some of the features that we care about, unless in the front end, is we have programmatic navigation, which means we can call a function to navigate somewhere else. We don't have declarative navigation, which makes sense because it's not linked to any front end. It's agnostic, so there is no way to declaring a link that goes to a specific place, like a route named home, for example, a route named user, or anything like that. We have navigation guides, that's part of the architecture. It comes by itself. We don't have dynamic routing because even though we can add routes on the fly with a function, we cannot remove them. So there is no way to have that dynamic routing. And we definitely don't have declarative routing, but that makes sense in the same way there is no declarative navigation. Now, we have something. I was on the wrong slide. My bad. This is the list of the things I was saying. So we have programmatic navigation, so it's calling a function. We don't have any declarative navigation because there is no front end. We have a navigation guards because that's part of the middleware architecture. We don't have dynamic routing because we cannot remove routes, and we have declarative. We don't have declarative routing because there is no front end. It's framework agnostic, so there is no way to saying this is the router. These are the routes that we can have. Okay, if we look at something else like Rich Router or React Router, which doesn't matter really much because the core principles are the same. There is one big thing that you're gonna find is the dynamic routing. Dynamic routing means that you can remove and add routes on demand. And then the page will adapt and everything will work correctly. Now, this is not the actual API that you have on React Router or Rich Router, because the idea for them is to have this declarative routing, which works very well with React mindset. The way you declare, you write things. Now, I'm not sure they changed that for the hooks. I didn't see anything changing that with hooks. So I'm pretty sure they keep this API. But basically, you have this component router where you're going to declare what is the path you want to define the view for, and then the component that affects that. The API may vary between the Rig Router and Rich Router, but it doesn't really matter. The idea is you write your routes with components. Now, if you look at the list of things you have on the Rich Router, you are going to have the programmatic navigation, although you may need to use hooks or the render functions, which is like the scope slots for Vue. We have declarative navigation, so we can have these link components. We don't have navigation guards, and this is a big pain point for users, is that they have to create their own higher order components, so components that wrap your views to handle this navigation based on the life cycle of the component, which is not even the same as we do on the router. And then you have dynamic routing and declarative routing, which is the two things I showed you before. Now, if we look at the router, it's quite different because you have all the routes in one file. It's what we call the configuration file, differently from the Rich Router, where because we have this declarative routing, you can split up all the route declarations in different files, which has its own advantages, but has the big disadvantage of being quite difficult to reach and search for existing routes. Whereas with a configuration base, you know that all the routes are going to be in one place. So it looks like this. You have this instance new router, you have the routes, you have the path, the component it renders. It's easy to read, it's easy to understand. And then you have the components, router link, and router view mainly. Now, if you look at the features of the Vue router, you have a programmatic navigation, you have declarative navigation, you have navigation guards, which we're going to talk about later a bit more about what are the differences. But you don't have dynamic routing. You have like partial dynamic routing. And if you have been a bit active on the issues, you will see that there are some issues that are quite stale. Nothing is going on there. And the reason is because the architecture, the configuration-based architecture and the code base wasn't think in the first place to handle this dynamic routing, because there are some things to take into account regarding how the view is going to render and stuff like that that are a bit more complicated to handle and require some major refactoring that we cannot handle. So we don't have proper dynamic routing. You can handle it by doing some hacky stuff, so at least it's possible, but you shouldn't do it that way. And there is no declarative routing, and this is because we don't have dynamic routing, basically. And all the routers are going to have this kind of architecture where you have the components, the router, and any router, you're going to see some kind of history module. We're going to talk about that a bit later. The components in Vue are, and very often are, you have two of them. You have the view and the link. There is nothing much to explain about that. The link is like an anchor, and the view is the component that you want to render. So that allows you to create your own layout as well. So let's dive a bit more into the APIs and what are the responsibilities for the router, what are the problems that come from that. For example, the router have three main responsibilities. We have the route matching, the navigation, and the creating routes functionality. Now, the route matching is being able to say, as a user, I don't want to create this format complicated that defines a route. I want to be able to just define a URL as a string, because at the end of the day, when the user comes to your application, they are entering a string anyway. So you want a way to transform a location into what we call a normalized location that is used all across your application and that makes very predictable what information you have when you're navigating. So match and result are very similar, basically. So they do almost the same thing. One is going to give you all the components and extra information, but they do pretty much the same. Now, the navigation is being able to access where we are and how do we move somewhere else, but also being able to control that navigation by canceling, aborting the navigation, or redirecting somewhere else. And then we have the creating routes, which in the case of the router, well, there isn't much. You have to either create a new instance where you pass the arrays of route, or you have add routes, but there is no remove routes as we wish. And if you look at the history model, it doesn't have that much at the end, or it shouldn't, because it's supposed to make the communication between your code and the URL, at least in the browser. And this is done by a few functions like push replace. And then it has this function listen that allows you to know when the user has clicked on the backward or forward button to go to a different place. But that's pretty much it. There is nothing else. So before going into the bad parts, as I call them, or the sad parts, I want to review a little bit the good parts of the router. So this is the part that we want to keep, that are nice, and that I think brings some value when you're developing applications. And make the code modular, because that's going to be important as well. So for example, the components themselves are quite nice because their responsibilities are well-defined. They are well encapsulated. The code is modular, so it's very nice to change them, to add new features. It's easy to know where we are going to add that new feature. For example, the router view only has to render the view where we are at. So it's going to read the current information from the router, which is what it reads from the $route, which is the current location. And it's going to pass params as props, maybe, depending on the configuration you have. The router link is a bit more complex, but it's still very well encapsulated. It's supposed to resolve the target location, so that's what I was saying before. If you have a string, you have an object, you must be able to transform that into a normalized location that has a very specific shape with always the same properties on the object, and it makes it very easy to work with. You also should be able to render an anchor tag with a link that behaves correctly, so that means is the user clicking while pressing the control or the command or the alt, like any modifier that modifies the behavior natively of the browser? You don't want to remove that behavior. But you still want to just use the history API, so basically don't do a full reload when you have a regular click. So you have to hop in the click, for example, and stuff like that. So that's handling the click event differently. And last but not least, applying the active behavior. So are we on the same URL as the link is pointing? And this is basically replicating the behavior of a normal anchor, if you think about it. Okay, it's just that we have to apply it by ourselves because the browser is not applying any specific. I mean, it's already applying some specific behavior, like did you visit this page before, and it's going to change the color. And the normalized route I was talking about is this kind of object that has everything in it. So some of the things may be undefined, like the name, if you don't give a name to a route. Some of the things may be missing, but you know, and you have the typings for that all the properties are going to be there, and they have a specific type, so it's very easy to manipulate and the navigations around. Now, another good part of the code of the Vue router are the navigation guides. Now, I think this is a big deal, especially when you compare to other frameworks, because being able to control how the navigation affects the user does bring a huge improvement in terms of UX, and it makes it very easy to implement them. Whereas if you have to rely on the component lifecycle is not that easy. And the different navigation guides that we have allows us to hook into different moments of the navigation, so we can get different kind of performance improvements. Now, the most common guide that we have is the global guide. Now, these are attached directly to the router. They are triggered every single time. And just to give you a quick review of how a guard works, you have these three arguments, to, which is where we're going to. The URL is a normalized location. From is a normalized location where we're coming from. And next is a function that you always have to call, and always call once, inside of the guard to say, do we validate the navigation, do we abort the navigation, or do we go somewhere else? Now, all the routers take this architecture, basically. So in the example, you have, for example, is the user logged in, then we redirect to the login page. If the person is not, if they are not authorized, you're gonna abort the navigation, and otherwise just gonna let them go through. So then we have the per route guards. Now these guards are applied at the route level. So similar to global guards, they're gonna be right next to the router, but these ones are applied specifically to a route record. Now, differently from that, we have the in-component guards. We have 3 of them, so before route enter, before route update, and before route leave. But these ones are inside of the component. Now, what is the big difference? The big difference is that because you're defining the guards inside of the component or outside of them, if you abort the navigation, you may be able to prevent fetching a chunk from your application. Okay, so if we're going to post, if we're going from post to admin, for example, we may have first the some global navigation guards. Then we have a route navigation guard, and if that one aborts, then the last guard is never going to get executed. But it goes further than that, because if you need to fetch that specific chunk, so if you do the basic transformation of changing any route component import into a dynamic import for your route configuration, which is recommended, and is done by default if you use Nux, for example, you are benefiting from these automatically. So in that case, if we have, for example, a before enter guard, and that guard is going to drop, it's going to say, no, the user is not going to go further, we're never going to fetch that component. We're never going to retrieve the chunk. So there is no network cost about it. Otherwise, we're going to fetch the component, and then once the component is fetched, we can read the option and execute that option. Okay. So that's it for like the good parts. And now we have the sad parts, which are well, the parts that I want to change. That makes me a bit sad as a developer because I have to deal with them as a maintainer, basically. The biggest one is having a clear division of responsibilities, which can also be associated with being modular. Now, if you look at the code of the router, you're going to see that the history and the router themselves, both modules, have quite a huge overlap. And this is the overlap itself is where the sadness comes from, basically. Some code that should be on the router or some responsibilities that belong to the router are being handled by the history. Now, to give you a very quick example, if you look at the before each code for the router, it's basically pushing a function into this array of before guards that is contained in the router class. So you could expect that the router is supposed to use that array for something. Now, if you look at the code of the push, so okay, it's a bit more complicated since last version because we handle push-based promise, promise-based push. But it was just before. If you look at the push, it's just calling the push from the history. So it means that the history has to handle these guards somewhere. So as a contributor, this is a problem. And this is one of the main issues I find, is that it's difficult for people to contribute, I feel. They often put the code on the wrong place, and it's normal, it's not that easy. I also make mistakes myself, even though I know the code base more or less well, I would say. Because you don't expect the history to do some stuff, so you don't expect the code to be there in the history. And it also brings another problem, is that it's harder to extend. If you want to extend the whole history module because you want to create a native script version for it, for example, which is not really very possible right now, well, you have to re-implement everything from the history because the code is not modular, is not decoupled, so it's not possible to just reuse the listener, so just reuse the state, like the push state part of the API. And this is, so just for the note, for example, native script has to provide their own overriding version of the router to be able to make it work. That's what I understood. So this is, of course, something we can improve in the future, not for them to have that layer of abstraction. Then we have this very common problem that bites a lot of users, is that the before route enter guard is executed before the component ever being mounted. So if you ever want to use information that appears in your component, if you do it with, for example, with Nux, or if you do classic, with Nux, basically you can just call the API, get the information, return it, and that's it. So you expect to be able to write user.name your code, even though you initialize on the line 7 the user to null. The problem is that code that you have there, where we set the user, happens after one render of the component. So it means that basically your component is rendering once with the user being null. So you need to wrap everything with a VF in your application, in your component. Hopefully this is something that we'll be able to change as well. And the reason it's a problem is because you find these differences between the 3 guards that we have in component. Now, of course, there are differences between them, like what is supposed to do a before out leave and a before out update is different. But the guard that you pass to them, the more they look like each other, the best, the more consistent, the easiest it is to move a guard from one part, so from an enter to an update, or to even reuse that for both of the hooks. So for example, the before out enter doesn't have access to this because it happens before the component to even be mounted, whereas the 2 other ones do have access to these because the component is alive while they happen. But to overcome that, we can pass a callback to the before out enter, but you don't have that API for the other ones because there is no need. You have access to these, so why would you even do that? So this brings some consistency problems that need to be fixed on a more internal level first, if you see what I mean. It's not, we could have a workaround to make things work, but the idea is to make things completely consistent, and it's possible. So what is going to save the router? What can we change here? So let's take a look at the API that we had before. And let's talk about the responsibilities. So what do we expect from one part of the router and the other? So the history, we have this API, but what are the responsibilities? We expect the history to be able to modify the location. We expect it to be able to parse the URL, so it should also handle the logic of URL parsing. And that means separating from a string, the path, the query, and the hash. So be able to also transform the query into an object. Should be able to notify when a location changes, which is what I explained before, and it's the listen part. It should be able to handle encoding problems, which is it looks very easy, but I remind you that there is Internet Explorer there, so it's not that easy as it looks like. And finally, it should be able to be overloaded. For the router, I was oversimplifying a little bit because in reality, there is these 2 things, a matcher and a router. Now, the distinction exists already on VueRouter, but I want to make it even clearer and give more, make sure that we divide the expectations and responsibilities for both of them. So about the matcher, the API, we can simplify, well, things may change, but this is mostly internal, but there is the resolve function, the add route record, and remove route record. The names do not matter because they can change in the future. About the expectations, we should be able to resolve allocation to a route record. So the matcher should only handle the path part of the URL. It doesn't care about the query, it doesn't care about the hash, but it should be able to transform the params and probably handle some encoding things that cannot be handled at the history level. It should be able to handle the priority of the route records, so this is important for dynamic routing. And it should be able to parse and handle params. So it should be able to transform an object of params into a URL, a string, and vice versa, basically. Now, the router. The router, we are removing some stuff of it. That's great. We are still leaving the navigation guards and a part of the dynamic routing there, because as a user, you shouldn't be using the matcher. You should be using the router. That's the only API, the public API you get, and the components as well. We also have to add the lazy loading routes is also going to handle that part, and the error handlers. So any error that may happen in a navigation guard, you may be able to catch that to send that to any online service. So about the responsibilities and expectations, we have the asynchronous navigation. So why is this? If you think about the HTML, the history in general, navigation, when you change, when you do push replace, the change should happen immediately. Okay, you know that it's going to happen. There are no guards. There is nothing to wait for. Just change the URL. Now, of course, the browser behavior may tune in and change some things, but it shouldn't. But from the router perspective, you have these navigation guards that can be asynchronous. So the navigation itself becomes asynchronous because it has to wait for the guards to finish. So it has to trigger the navigation guards. It should expose where we are at. It should handle the redirection. So it looks simple, but it means that it has to rerun all the guards. We have to change where we're going from. We have to keep a trace of what is the redirection stack and stuff like that. And then we have the dynamic routing, which is something I will dive into a bit more. Right now, talking about the cool new stuff coming to the router. So as you may imagine, the code is going to be rewritten in TypeScript. I think this is a good improvement to contribution. It also exposed some lower-level types that were not available before for TypeScript. So it means that we have to think about what public types we expose, so they can be used for the user, like errors, for example, and stuff like that. And it also makes, because we are doing everything in TypeScript, we don't have any disconnection between the code that is written in JavaScript, because there is no JavaScript anymore, and the actual types that we expose. There is a new thing that is already available, is the scope slot. So that allows you to get full customization on the navigation element that you want to render. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but because there is an RFC for it, there is documentation, and it's already usable. There are navigation failures, so I want to be able to provide a bit more information on why something is failing, because you have different ways of making a navigation fail. So that means that whenever you call push, you are expecting the router to make that navigation, but that navigation may not happen because you redirect, because you abort, or because another navigation happens in between. There are different cases like that. And you want to be able to report back and say, this is what happened. So by having specific kind of errors, you can have more information. Now this allows you to do, with a promise-based API, to try catch on the router part push. The cool thing is that because we're using a promise-based API instead of a callback-based API, we do keep clean stack traces. So you're able to trace back where you said to the router, no, this navigation is not going to happen. I want to abort that. So we can get a debugger. We can just go, if we stop on the errors, we can get back to the specific next call that made the navigation fail. And these will allow you to report back to services like Sentry, because that's a screenshot from Sentry. So from the users on production, you can get that information. Now, this is a stack tree from the current Vue router, so it doesn't have that much information. As for the histories, because we're moving to a more modular architecture, we are exposing a specific interface that has to be implemented. And these will allow users to extend the navigations, the history. So that means that it should allow people to create a history for a native navigation and stuff like that. So of course the API has to change. I'm not even sure it will be mode, but it doesn't really matter. The idea is that instead of providing just a string, we provide this object that is going to be used. Kind of like the renderer of Vue, where we have to pass these low-level remove, add, modify. I'm not using the right names, but that doesn't matter. And then we have these, which is, I think, the biggest new improvement that we have is the path ranking. So nowadays, right now, if you use the Vue router, the order you define the routes is very important because they're going to be matched in that order. It means that if you include a route that is going to match anything, like the one I have just on the screen, it's always going to be matching whatever you do, whatever you try to push. So that's why you have, I think that we have a specific case for the star route, but it's also more visible with parameters as well. So you may never reach the route that you want if they are able to match the same string, okay? And so we're changing that, and this is a small... Who has ever seen this page or used it before? Great. So there is like one person. and it's Natalia from the core team. So, so this is a path ranker. It's a debugger of the next version from the dynamic routing in the matcher, basically, and the dynamic routing in VueRouter. On the left, you have the routes you can include in any order, and on the right, you're going to see the routes ranked from the most important one, the most specific one, and the one that should be tested first to the least specific. And you can also type something. I know it's a bit small, but so for example, if I type, hey, it's only going to put in green this one. It's not very, maybe it's not very visible. No, actually, it's visible. If you type something different, like for example, I have documents/mine is gonna match two records. So the one with a dynamic parameter, but also the one with a static string. But because the static string is more important, it has a higher priority, a higher ranking, is going to match that one. So no matter how you include the routes, this is going to work. And this is crucial for dynamic routing because it means that now you can have these add routes, remove routes, and the result is always going to work correctly, ideally. Now, just one note about this is please don't use dynamic routing for security. That doesn't work. Just secure your endpoints. And don't think that because you're hiding the routes of the user that a student that is just trying to hack your website is not going to be able to access your pages. This is all about user experience, not security, because you're in the front. So you don't want the user to end up in a situation where they are not supposed to be, and they cannot interact with anything because all the requests are failing, because they are not an admin and they cannot do anything on the page. All the things that are coming, but they are subject to changes, so I don't want to spend too much time on it, is the composition API, of course, so a way to get the API of the router link, but on a more lower level, so you can do anything you want with it. And you also have location, use the router, probably all the navigation guides as well, but that can change. There is also a bigger interest in test. So I've been doing this also for the current VueRouter version. This is mostly using browser stack to get tests running on different browsers. So we don't get regressions, especially for Internet Explorer, because it's not a browser, so it doesn't work. No, it's using different specs instead of what everybody else is using. So yeah, you cannot expect things to be working the same way. Some more RFCs, so some are already there. There are already some people creating some RFC, that's great. There are some to come, so accessibility improvements, kind of providing some way of, simple ways to get the user to get focus management. For example, there are also I always forget the name in English, and that kills me. Being able to, the announcer pattern, that's it. Being able to announce where you are, where you're going, etc. And also more navigation information, which is already implemented. For example, where we coming from? Are we going back? Is the user clicking on the backwards button? Is the user clicking on the forward button? Or we don't know, because there are cases where we cannot know. And initially, I was thinking of supporting both. So having a VueRouter for that works for both, or at least having the same code base and then fork or something. But looking at how much time it takes and how much my time is limited, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to focus first on supporting V3. But because the architecture is getting more modular and different layers, theoretically, I should be able to move to different versions. But that's not going to be my focus, so I don't want to do any commitment to that. So we're going to mostly backport some other smaller improvements that we can achieve in VueRouter 3. So they work with Vue 2, and especially any deprecation warnings or anything that eases the migration process in the future. So that's all I wanted to say for today. I just want to quickly say thanks to my sponsors on GitHub. So if you ever want to support me on my work, give me more time, my free time to work on these things, I have a sponsorship with GitHub. And these are my sponsors right now, and the link is very simple to go to. I hope you learned something about routers today, and it keeps you excited about the next version. Thank you.